The Roman army in West Africa on the Niger River, 1st century BC. Part 3. The regions of West Africa, particularly those watered by the Niger, have long been observed to furnish a notable proportion of the captives conveyed in the transatlantic slave trade. It has been remarked by careful inquirers that these lands were by no means unknown to antiquity. Roman expeditions, both military and commercial, are believed to have penetrated the desert and made acquaintance with the inhabitants of the Niger Basin between the 1st and 4th centuries of our era. It is further deemed probable that some of those thus engaged were Roman citizens, rather soldiers, merchants, or agents of the imperial state. In latter centuries, European scholars, among whom H.A.S. Johnson is preeminent, entertained the notion that the Fulani, the founders of the Sokoto Caliphate, were of venerable descent, being either akin to the lost tribes of Israel or derived from Roman soldiery. Within such a conception, the Fulani were regarded as a people of ancient repute and distinction, though, as history attests, many of them fell victim to the enslaving enterprise of the Atlantic traffic or slave trade. From this perspective, the people transported to the Americas were imagined as carrying traces of both Western and Eastern civilization with them, even as they endured the hardships of the Atlantic slave trade. Western being Roman, Eastern being Near Eastern civilization. More to come on this particular history of the biblical and historical Israelites. But let's continue with the history of the children of Israel. Universal Center for Renovation presents historical and biblical Israelites. This video is strictly for educational purposes and commentary. This video is of biblical and secular historical literature. So, enjoy. The children of Israel departed Egypt with great substance. The book of Genesis, chapter 15, verse 14. Biblical and other historical sources record that the Israelites, when they left Egypt during the Exodus, they departed with great wealth, sometimes described as the wealth of the world, including gold, silver, and other treasures that have been deposited in Egypt over generations. This is an expansion of the biblical account in the book of Genesis, chapter 15, verse 14, and the book of Exodus, chapter 12 to 13. According to the Hebrew Israelite legends, as recorded by Louis Ginsburg in the book Legends of the Jews, the Israelites departed Egypt with enormous wealth, described as the wealth of the world, accumulated and deposited over generations. This foundational wealth, combined with the later conquest of the land of Canaan and its position along key trade routes, placed the Israelites during the reigns of King David and Solomon in a position of considerable economic influence. From this perspective, their control over Canaan's cities and access to international trade routes allowed them to participate and indirectly influence regional and global commerce, connecting the Mediterranean, Arabian, African, Asian, and European worlds. According to biblical tradition, as expressed in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 28, verse 13, the Most High promised that Israel would be the head and not the tail, a metaphor for preeminence and leadership among the nations, connecting the legendary wealth and influence of the Israelites to the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 28, verse 13, which in contrast is part of the blessings promised for obedience to their God, Yahweh. And the Lord shall make thee the head, and not the tail, and thou shalt be above only, and thou shalt not be beneath. The story begins with Abraham, to whom God promised that his descendants would be strangers in a foreign land, but would eventually leave with great wealth, as stated in the book of Genesis, chapter 15, verse 14. And also, that nation whom they shall serve will I judge, and afterward shall they come out with great substance. In the book of Genesis, chapter 15, verse 13 to 14, God tells Abraham that his descendants will be strangers in a foreign land, enslaved and oppressed, but that they will eventually be delivered with great wealth. From the biblical perspective, Abraham was aware, not in full detail, but prophetically, that his descendants would endure a period of hardship in Egypt before being freed. This foresight is central to the narrative of God's covenant with Abraham. God's covenant and promises weren't just with Abraham, but were passed to his son Isaac, even in the dramatic context of the near sacrifice. That event emphasizes Abraham's faith and the continuation of God's plan through Isaac, who would inherit the promises of land, descendants, and blessings. The covenant the Most High made with Abraham was passed to Isaac, who in turn passed it to his son Jacob, rather than to his older brother Esau. Jacob, who would later be named Israel, received the promise of numerous descendants, land, and divine blessing. On his journey, Jacob experienced a vision of a ladder reaching from the earth to heaven, with angels ascending and descending, and heard the Most High reaffirm the covenant, ensuring him of protection, prosperity, and the fulfillment of Abraham's promises. This vision symbolized the continuity of divine guidance and the enduring nature of the covenant, which would shape the destiny of Jacob's descendants, the Israelites. Jacob's wrestling and renaming in the book of Genesis, chapter 32, verse 22 to 32. It marks a transformation. Jacob becomes Israel, meaning he who is a prince with power, or God, symbolizing both spiritual authority and the continuity of the covenant. He wrestled through the night with an angel. At dawn he was given a new name, Israel, meaning he is a prince with power, or God, signifying both his personal transformation and his new role as the leader of God's chosen people. This encounter affirmed Jacob's, Israel's spiritual authority and the continuation of the covenant, establishing him as the patriarch, whose descendants, the 12 tribes of Israel, would inherit the promises of land, prosperity, and divine favor. Israel, a nation of many colors. Membership in Israel is defined by descent from Jacob, also known as Israel, not by physical appearance, phenotype, or modern racial categories. The 12 sons and their tribes form the foundation of the Israelite people or nation, and historically and biblically, identity is lineage-based, not based on external traits. In the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 33, verse 23, Moses prophetically blesses the tribe of Naphtali, stating that they possess the west and the south. Scholars and later interpreters have observed that Naphtali never historically inhabited the southern regions of the land of Canaan, suggesting that this prophecy refers to a distant future dispersion of that tribe. From this perspective, some traditions interpret the West as a reference to the Western Hemisphere, indicating that in the last days, the descendants of Naphtali, and by extension of the Israelite tribes, would live far from their ancestral lands in the land of Canaan and inhabit the Western Hemisphere, the Americas. Jacob, or Israel, had 12 sons, among whom Joseph was particularly favored by his father and distinguished by his prophetic abilities. His brothers, consumed with jealousy, sold him into slavery, and he was taken to Egypt. There, through a combination of wisdom, administrative skill, and divine favor, Joseph rose to become the most powerful man in the land, only after Pharaoh himself. His position in Egypt later allowed him to preserve his family during a severe famine, bringing the Israelites into Egypt and setting the stage for their eventual enslavement, which have been foretold to Abraham centuries earlier. When the famine struck Egypt and the surrounding lands, Joseph, as Pharaoh's second in command, managed the distribution of grain that had been stored during 7 years of abundance. People from across Egypt came to buy grain, and eventually his own brothers arrived, seeking food. Though they did not recognize Joseph at first, through a series of tests, Joseph revealed himself to his brothers, forgave them for selling him into slavery, and invited his entire family, including his father, Jacob, to settle in Egypt. This relocation brought the Israelites into Egypt, where they initially lived in prosperity in the land of Goshen. But it also set the stage for their eventual enslavement as their numbers grew over generations. According to the book, The Legends of the Jews, the famine that struck Egypt under Joseph's administration affected not only the Nile region, but also neighboring lands, including the land of Canaan, Phoenicia, Arabia, and other parts of Mesopotamia. It was thus a famine of extraordinary scale, impacting the entire Near Eastern world. Joseph's careful management of Egypt's grain reserves during this period was therefore critical, as people traveled great distances to buy food. This included his own brothers, who came to Egypt seeking relief. Through his administrative skill, wisdom, and divine favor, Joseph was able to provide for the survival of countless families and ultimately invite his own family to settle in Egypt, laying the groundwork for the Israelite presence that would grow over generations and eventually face enslavement. During the famine, the wealth of the Near Eastern world flowed into Egypt as nations and cities sought to obtain grain. Pharaoh and Joseph received payment in gold, silver, livestock, and other valuable goods, making Egypt the central hub of trade and commerce in the region. Joseph's administration not only preserved life, but also transformed Egypt into the dominant economic power of the Near East. Through his position, the Israelites were placed at the center of this network, gaining access to knowledge, resources, and influence that would later shape their cultural and economic legacy in the region. Joseph's management of the grain reserves during the famine not only saved lives, but elevated Egypt to the dominant economic and political power of the Near East. By controlling the distribution of food and receiving payment from surrounding nations, Egypt effectively became the center of regional trade, with Joseph as the chief administrator, orchestrating the flow of wealth and resources. After Joseph's death, a pharaoh arose in Egypt who did not know Joseph. The book of Exodus, chapter 1, verse 8. Forgetting the immense contributions Joseph had made to the nation of Egypt, this ruler sought not merely to maintain Egypt's dominance, but to expand it further, aiming to control Near Eastern trade routes and acquire additional territories. Seeing the rapidly growing Israelite population as a potential threat to his plans for control and conquest and consolidation, he subjected them to harsh labor, initiating the period of Israelite enslavement. This marked the beginning of a new chapter in the Israelites' history, one of oppression that had been foretold centuries earlier to Abraham, yet which would ultimately lead to their dramatic exodus from Egypt. Archaeological evidence from ancient Egypt provides concrete insight into the lives of enslaved peoples and laborers, showing the harsh conditions under which they worked. Excavations of tombs, workers' villages, and hieroglyphics depictions reveal tasks such as quarrying, construction, and agricultural labor, along with some organization, diet, and housing arrangements. These findings support the biblical depiction of the Israelites' enslavement, while also showing that forced labor in Egypt was part of a broader economic and political system. As foretold to Abraham centuries earlier, the Israelites were ultimately liberated from Egyptian bondage under the leadership of Moses, a descendant of the tribe of Levi. Moses, called by God to deliver his people, led the exodus from Egypt, guiding the Israelites towards freedom and fulfilling the divine promise that Abraham's descendants would leave Egypt with great substance. This liberation marked a pivotal moment in Israelite history, establishing their identity as a people chosen by God and setting the stage for their settlement in the land of Canaan, their accumulation of wealth, and the continuation of the covenant through successive generations. This image captures the biblical and legendary emphasis on the Exodus as both liberation and restitution. The Israelites not only left Egypt in freedom, but also carried wealth, possessions, and resources, which were a form of divine justice for the generations of unpaid labor they had endured under Pharaoh. This wealth of Egypt included grain, gold, silver, livestock, and other valuables, reflecting both practical provision for the journey and symbolic fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham that his descendants would leave with great substance. The book of Genesis, chapter 15, verse 14. From the book Legends of the Jews by Louis Ginsburg, Volume 1. The children of Israel spoke to Moses and said, God has led us from Egypt to give us the wealth of Egypt. In the book Legends of the Jews, Louis Ginsburg emphasizes that Moses framed the Exodus not only as liberation from slavery, but also as the transfer of wealth and resources from Egypt, portraying it as part of God's providence and justice. The Israelites' departure with Egypt's wealth symbolized both divine favor and the material fulfillment of centuries of oppression. From Abraham's prophetic vision to the Exodus and beyond, a central theme is the transfer of wealth, both material and cultural, that captures the central idea. The Exodus was not just a liberation from slavery. It was also the movement of the Near East accumulated wealth into the hands of Israel. Under Joseph's administration, Egypt had become the repository of the region's resources: grain, gold, silver, livestock, and other valuables. transferred from neighboring nations during the famine. When the Israelites departed, this wealth went with them, providing both practical means for survival and symbolic fulfillment of divine promise. The tabernacle represents the first organized national project of Israel after the Exodus. It was not just a religious structure. It was a symbol of nationhood, divine guidance, and centralized organization, showing how the Israelites used the wealth and resources they carried from Egypt to establish themselves as a coherent people. The tabernacle meant everything to the Israelites. It was much more than a tent or a religious structure. It served as the physical, spiritual, and national center of their emerging identity after the Exodus. The tabernacle was considered the dwelling place of the Most High God among His people. It symbolized that the Most High God was not distant, but walking with them through the wilderness. The Ark of the Covenant, kept inside the tent, represented the covenant between God and Israel, reminding them of promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It centralized worship for the 12 tribes, creating a shared religious and cultural focus. Building and maintaining it required coordination of labor, materials, and craftsmanship, which helped forge a sense of national organization and identity. The tabernacle's precise construction and rituals reinforced the importance of following God's commands. It taught that prosperity and protection came from faithful obedience, connecting daily life to divine guidance, using wealth and materials brought from Egypt. The tabernacle showcased the Israelites' skill, artistry, and ability to organize a large-scale project, demonstrating their emergence as a structured, civilized nation in the world. The construction of the tabernacle wasn't just a spiritual act. It was also a massive display of material wealth, craftsmanship, and organization. The Israelites brought gold, silver, bronze, fine linens, precious stones, and other valuables from Egypt, all of which were used to create a sacred and exquisite, detailed, structured, skilled artisans. Bezalel, Aholiab, oversaw its construction, demonstrating not only artistic mastery, but also the ability of the Israelites to organize a large, coordinated, national project. Indeed, the Israelites bore so much away from Egypt that one of them alone might have defrayed the expense of building and furnishing the tabernacle. Louis Ginsburg, Legends of the Jews, Volume 1. According to Legends of the Jews, the wealth carried by the Israelites from Egypt was immense. Louis Ginsburg notes that each individual possessed enough personal resources that a single person could have covered the full expense of building and furnishing the tabernacle. Modern calculations of the tabernacle have been estimated at the equivalent of $400 million to $500 million US dollars, underscoring both the material magnitude of the Exodus and the extraordinary resources the Israelites brought with them. This wealth, combined with their skills, labor, and organization, allowed them to undertake the tabernacle project, establishing a centralized, sacred, and culturally sophisticated symbol of nationhood in the wilderness. The tabernacle, the Israelites' first national building project after the Exodus, was constructed using immense wealth and skilled craftsmanship. Its framework and furniture included gold, silver, bronze, and acacia wood, while its coverings were made of fine linen, goat hair, and dyed ram skins. Precious stones adorned the high priest's garments and sacred objects. Furnishings included the Ark of the Covenant with its mercy seat, the table of showbread, the golden lampstand or menorah, the altar of incense, the altar of burnt offering, and the laver for ceremonial washing. The tabernacle represented both divine presence and national identity, made possible by the extraordinary material wealth the Israelites brought from Egypt. Here's an extreme high comprehensive model market estimate of the total value of the tabernacle of Moses from the book of Exodus, chapter 25 to 40, including all materials, plus skilled labor, plus gemstones, plus textiles, plus wood, plus other costly inputs, not just the precious metals. Number 1. Precious metals: gold, silver, bronze. Modern estimates using current precious metal prices put the metal component alone very high. Gold, 29 talents plus 730 shekels equals 34,000 to 36,000 ounces, equals 1 ton plus. 70 to 150 million plus, depending on gold price. Silver, 100 talents plus 1,775 shekels equals 120,000 to 130,000 ounces, 3 to 6 million. Bronze, copper alloy, 5,000 plus pounds, 10,000 to 30,000 as raw material. Subtotal metals only equals 75 to 160 million US dollars just for raw materials alone. tabernacle had several names that emphasized its spiritual and national significance. It was often called the tent of meeting because it was the place where God met with Moses and communicated his will to the people. It was also called the sanctuary, highlighting its role as the sacred dwelling of God among the Israelites. These names reflect that the tabernacle was both a religious center and a symbol of Israelite nationhood in the wilderness. Number 2, fabric, dyes, textiles, and leather. The tabernacle called for fine linen, blue, purple, scarlet threads, goat hair, ram skins dyed red, badger, sea cow hides. These ancient dyes, especially purple from murex snails, were extremely expensive per ounce in antiquity, far more than typical cotton or wool today. While precise modern values are debated, some analysts estimate these non-metal materials alone at 10 to 30 million, depending on how one prices luxury textiles. Inside the tabernacle, priests performed sacred rituals, offered incense at the altar of incense, maintained the menorah, and prepared the showbread. Moses entered the most holy place to meet with God and receive guidance for the nation. The tabernacle also served as a center for instruction, covenant observance, and organizing festivals, making it the spiritual, cultural, and administrative heart of Israelite life in the wilderness. Number 3, wood, oils, spices, and incense. Other costly components included acacia wood, dense, rot-resistant hardwood for frames, boards, and structures, olive oil, anointing oil, and fragrant spices required for lamps and sacred rituals. These aren't nearly as costly as gold, but high-grade wood plus significant quantities of oil and spices could add several hundred thousands to a few $1,000,000 in value in modern terms. The priests of Israel were members of the tribe of Levi, descendants of Jacob's son Levi, while the high priest was always drawn from the family of Aaron, Moses' brother. This structure ensured that the priesthood remained within a divinely appointed lineage, with the Levites carrying out ritual duties and the high priest serving as the chief spiritual leader and mediator between God and the people. Number 4, gemstones and priest garments. The high priest garments included precious stones set in the breastplate, 12 stones representing the tribes, gold woven threads in priestly garments, and embroidered coverings. Depending on what gemstones are assumed, emerald, sapphire, ruby, etc., and their quality. This category alone could add tens of millions or more of value. Some commentators note the priestly clothing could weigh 40 to 60 pounds of materials alone, including gold and stones. According to Josephus, 1st century Levite, priest and ruler of Israel, the Israelites acquired advanced skills in Egypt, including engineering, construction, and administration. These abilities allowed them to organize labor, manage resources, and undertake complex projects, such as the construction of the tabernacle. Their Egyptian training, combined with the wealth they carried from Egypt, made the Israelites not only a liberated people, but also a technically capable and organized nation, ready to establish themselves in the land of Canaan. Number 5, skilled labor and craftsmanship. The text explicitly credits highly skilled artisans such as Bezalel and Aholiab and many others in metalworking, weaving, and embroidery, crafting gold overlaid panels, weaving embroidered curtains, building wood frames, and carving intricate details would take hundreds or thousands of skilled labor hours. A rough, extreme modern estimate for artisanship. Suppose 1,000 skilled workers working for 1 year at 60,000 a year. That's 60 million plus. Add specialized artisans, master goldsmiths, weavers, jewelers at premium rates. Another 50 million plus or more. Labor could easily rival or exceed the material costs when valued by today's standards. This is speculative, but illustrates extreme valuation. Extreme modern total value range, all inclusive. Cost component, lower bound, and upper bound high value. Metals, gold, silver, bronze, lower bound, 75 million. Upper bound high value, 160 million plus. For textiles, dyes, and leather for the tabernacle. The lower bound, 10 million. Upper bound prices, 30 million plus. For wood, oils, spices, lower bound, 1 million. Upper bound, 5 million plus. For gemstones and priestly accoutrements, 10 million lower bound, 50 million plus high value upper bound. Skilled labor and craftsmanship, lower bound, 30 million. High value, 100 million plus for upper bound. Total estimate value, lower bound, 126 million. Upper bound, 345 million plus. High-end extreme estimate, up to 300 to 400 million or more in today's market value. These values assume modern commodity prices, luxury textiles costing at premium, gemstones valued as fine quality, and labor cost as contemporary skilled craftsmanship rates. Ancient economies, materials, and social values differ significantly, so this is a modern monetary analogy, a replacement cost style estimate. The Israelites left Egypt at the Exodus bearing immense wealth, drawn not only from Egypt, but symbolically from the riches of the world. This treasure was granted by the Egyptians under divine compulsion and served as just compensation for generations of slavery, fulfilling God's promise to Abraham that Israel would depart with great substance. In the wilderness, this same wealth was consecrated for sacred use, providing the gold, silver, fabrics, and materials used to construct the tabernacle. Thus, in Ginsburg's telling, the riches gained through oppression were transformed into instruments of holiness, marking Israel's redemption not only through freedom, but through the ability to create a dwelling place for God, their God, Yahweh. The summary, extreme interpretive conclusion. Metals alone, 75 to 160 million plus. All materials plus textiles plus stones, 100 to 250 million plus. Full value, including skilled labor, likely 200 to 400 million or more in current market value. The Israelites departed Egypt at the Exodus with immense wealth, understood in tradition as the accumulated riches of Egypt and symbolically of the world. This wealth fulfilled God's promise to Abraham and served as just recompensation for centuries of enslavement. In the wilderness, these riches were transformed into sacred purpose through the construction of the tabernacle. Based on modern estimates, the value of the tabernacle's metals alone may have reached $75 to $160 million, with all materials including textiles and precious stones ranging from 100 to 250 million. When skilled craftsmanship and labor are included, the total value likely rose to 200 to 400 million or more, possibly approaching $500 million. In Ginsburg's telling, the tabernacle thus stands as a powerful symbol of redemption, wealth born of oppression, consecrated into a dwelling place for God. In the tradition preserved by Louis Ginsburg's Legends of the Jews, the immense wealth carried out of Egypt at the Exodus became the material foundation for Israel's later national development. First consecrated in the wilderness through the construction of the tabernacle, this wealth was preserved and transmitted across generations. In latter biblical and post-biblical interpretations, it is seen as contributing to the economic base of the united monarchy under King David and King Solomon. During this period, Israel stood at a strategic crossroad between Europe, Asia, and Africa, benefiting from control or influence over major land and maritime trade routes. Under Solomon in particular, biblical tradition and history emphasizes international commerce, tribute, and luxury, suggesting that Israel's early sacred wealth evolved into royal and national prosperity. Thus, in this interpretive framework, the riches of the Exodus became the seed from which Israel's spiritual, political, and economic power ultimately grew. According to Louis Ginsburg's Legends of the Jews, the wealth of the world taken at the Exodus was not an abstract blessing, but a transferable store of material wealth. This treasure could be accumulated, transferred, captured, or lost, and whoever possessed it held disproportionate economic and political influence over nations. In this tradition, wealth functions as a divinely governed instrument of history rather than mere prosperity. The book of Deuteronomy, chapter 28:12, reflects this idea by portraying economic abundance as a sign of covenantal favor that enables leadership rather than dependence. Within Ginsburg's interpretive world, control of such wealth shapes international power, determining which peoples rise to prominence and which fell, according to divine justice and obedience. The wealth of the world exists as a quantifiable treasury that can be transferred from one nation to another by divine decree, taken from Egypt, entrusted to Israel, later lost through disobedience. Possession of this wealth confers not only prosperity, but legitimate political and moral leadership among nations. Economic power is therefore inseparable from obedience to the covenant. And historically, the outcomes of who has this treasure reflects divine justice rather than structural forces or luck. On January 1st, 2026, China implemented a new silver export licensing regime, requiring government approval for most other countries' refined silver exports, 60 to 70% of the global supply. By restricting access to this key industrial commodity, China exerts leverage over global markets and manufacturing, illustrating the same principle seen in ancient traditions. Control of essential resources confers economic and political power. This can be seen as an effort to transfer influence from the Anglo-American system to China's system, shifting the flow of strategic wealth and supply chains. Historically, the Anglo-American system accumulated its wealth through centuries of trade and conquest, tracing back to medieval trade hubs like Amsterdam, Genoa, and Venice, as well as Byzantine and Roman networks. Some of this wealth was further enriched by the treasure of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, captured by the Romans in the year 70 AD and redistributed across the empire, eventually ceding European financial and mercantile power. By controlling exports, China gains influence over global supply and pricing dynamics. In this light, the influence of Joseph, the archetype of strategic management of resources, can still be seen today. Nations that control critical stores of wealth, commodities, and trade routes continue to wield global power. Rather in sacred treasure, imperial loots, or strategic metals like silver, power depends not only on possessing resources, but on managing the systems that distribute them.